The sky was the first map, long before compasses were carved and maps were drawn on parchment. The frontiersman looked up to the heavens and found direction in the dance of clouds, in the quiet glow of morning light, in the slow breathing of the wind. He was a man who lived beneath an endless ceiling of blue and gray, where every shade meant something. When the dawn burned crimson, he knew rain would follow. When the stars sharpened against a black night, he felt the bite of cold drawing near. And when the horizon shimmered gold, the world whispered, "Travel while the light is kind." He did not learn this from a teacher, nor from a book. He learned it from hunger, from fear, from nights when the fire died and the wolves sang in the dark. The sky was both a warning and a promise. It told him when to rest and when to run. The clouds spoke in their own dialect. Their edges were letters, their movement a script. He read them the way poets read heartbreak, carefully, reverently, as if every pattern might be his last chance to live another day. When he journeyed west, over plains that stretched like eternity, the frontiersman became a shadow among shadows. No roads, no signs, no human voice, only the language of the land, the whisper of grass, the direction of smoke, the way light bent around distant hills. He would spit into the wind, feel which cheek it kissed, and know where north lay. The old ones called it instinct. He called it survival. Every morning began with silence. He would sit wrapped in a blanket of worn leather, eyes tracing the slow unfurling of dawn. The color of the sky told him more than 1,000 pages could. Pale blue meant calm. A streak of violet at the edge of the clouds meant a storm brooding somewhere beyond the ridge. He watched the birds too. If the hawks flew low, the air was heavy with moisture. If they circled high, the land would stay dry. Even the insects, tiny prophets of the earth, carried messages on their restless wings. In those days, every moment demanded awareness. You could not afford to ignore the world, because the world was not merciful. A single misread sign, a wrong turn, a storm underestimated, could turn a man into a forgotten bone in the grass. So he learned, he listened, he remembered. Each sunrise was a test, and each sunset a quiet victory. And perhaps that was the beauty of it all, the brutal simplicity of living by signs written not by men, but by nature itself. To read the sky was not merely to survive, it was to belong. The frontiersman did not conquer the wilderness, he translated it. He became fluent in wind, in rain, in silence. And in that unspoken language, he found what no map could give, a sense of direction that came from the soul, not from the compass. When modern men look up now, they see only weather. But once, that same sky held stories, secrets, and salvation. It was the first teacher, the truest guide. And for those who learned to read it, it was the only map they ever needed. The wind was the oldest storyteller of the frontier, unseen, untamed, yet always speaking. To the untrained, it was only noise, a restless whisper through the trees. But to the frontiersman, the wind was memory itself. It carried scents from far-off rivers, secrets from mountain ridges, and warnings from storms still miles away. It was an invisible companion, constant and unpredictable, reminding him that even silence had a voice. If you learned how to listen, he would stand still, eyes closed, face turned slightly upward, feeling the breath of the land touch his skin. A warm gust from the south meant a change, a shift in weather, or perhaps in fate. A cold push from the north carried the sting of snow and the scent of pine. The west wind was heavy, full of dust and exhaustion, whispering tales from distant deserts. And when the wind blew from the east, it came with a strange sadness, as if it carried the echoes of those who had tried to tame this land and failed in the wilderness. There were no compasses, no roads, no comforting lines of civilization. The wind was the compass. It carved its presence into every blade of grass, every ripple in the river, every howl of the wolf. The frontiersmen learned to read it the way others read books, by its rhythm, its weight, its tone. A sharp, cutting wind meant a storm's teeth were near. A low, mournful hum through the canyons meant the earth itself was sighing. He listened, always, because in listening he stayed alive. At times, the wind became his only companion. For weeks, he might travel without meeting another soul. No human voice, no music, only the chorus of wind through trees. It spoke to him in moments of despair, in nights when the fire dwindled and loneliness clawed at his thoughts. It became his prayer, his guide, his warning. When it howled too loud, he knew to seek shelter. When it softened, he dared to move forward. He remembered the way it changed with the land. In the forests, it spoke gently, threading through leaves like fingers on a harp. In the plains, it roared, wild, proud, endless. And in the mountains, it came from everywhere at once, like the breath of gods deciding whether to bless or curse. The wind carried not just sound, but knowledge. The direction it came from could lead him to water or away from danger. Sometimes, it even carried the faint smell of smoke, a distant campfire, a warning that men were near. In the wind, the frontiersman found something almost holy. It reminded him that the world was alive, breathing, watching, aware. The wind did not care who he was, what he'd done, or where he was going. It simply existed, ancient and eternal. But if you respected it, and the maps grew more detailed, the wind lost its audience. Men built walls to silence it, windows to keep it out. But those who once lived by it, those who knew its moods, its songs, its hidden meanings, carried a piece of it in their souls forever. Because to truly listen to the wind was to hear the heartbeat of the earth itself. In the wilderness, the earth was a book, and every footprint was a verse. To survive, the frontiersman had to learn to read it, to follow trails not made by men, but by beasts, who knew this land far longer than any human ever would. Each broken twig, each bent blade of grass, each faint print in the mud was part of a silent story written by claws and hooves. To most, it looked like chaos. To him, it was scripture, sacred, precise, alive. He would kneel low, fingers brushing over the soil, as if tracing the lines of fate itself. The sun might be fading, the wind cold on his neck, but his eyes were sharp and patient. A single track told him everything. The animal's weight, its speed, even its fear. A deer's print pressed deep meant it was running. A wolf's print over it meant the chase had begun. He could tell how old the trail was by how the edges had dried or filled with dust. The land spoke in whispers, and he, the quiet reader, listened with reverence. Every trail was more than a path. It was a map of survival. To follow the animals was to find water, food, safety, or danger. Rabbits led him to the lush heart of the forest, where streams ran clear. Buffalo trails curved toward hidden plains, where the grass grew high and sweet. And if he followed the vultures, he would find death, a carcass, a warning, a reminder that nature gave and took without apology. Out here, even the insects left trails. A line of ants told of sweet sap nearby. A sudden silence meant a predator had come. He learned to move as they did, slow, deliberate, silent. His boots barely kissed the ground. His breath matched the rhythm of the trees. When he walked through the woods, the animals sometimes did not notice him at all. It wasn't magic, it was humility. The frontiersman did not walk above nature. He walked within it. The beasts did not see a conqueror. They saw another creature, simply trying to survive. There were days when he would track for hours, following a single trail across rivers, over rocks, through endless grasslands. Sometimes he found what he sought. Sometimes the trail vanished like smoke. But even in failure, he learned, because every mark on the ground told him something new about the world. How soft the earth became before rain. How shadows stretched longer when the prey was near. How silence itself could scream if you knew what to listen for at night. Beside his small fire, he would remember the day's trails like prayers. He would replay them in his mind, every turn, every clue, every lesson. He knew that one day, when his strength would fade and his eyes would dim, the same trails might lead others to him. And maybe, when they knelt where he once walked, they would understand the same truth, that to follow the tracks of another living thing was not to hunt it, but to honor it, because, in the end, the wilderness belonged to the ones who paid attention. And for the frontiersman, reading those trails was more than survival. It was faith. It was belonging. It was understanding the divine rhythm of life and death, written quietly into the dust. There was an art to walking, not the kind you learned as a child, but one born of necessity, fear, and reverence. The frontiersman did not walk as civilized men did. He moved. Each step was a decision, each breath an act of patience. In the wild, noise was danger, and silence was life. To survive meant to disappear, to let the forest believe you were one of its own. He had watched animals all his life, how the cougar placed its paws as if testing the earth's trust, how the deer glided without breaking a twig, how the snake slipped unseen through fallen leaves. They did not ask permission from the land. They simply belonged. And so he learned from them that silence was not the absence of sound, but the art of being accepted by the earth itself. His boots, weathered by 1,000 miles, no longer creaked. The soles were thin, almost an extension of his skin. He walked on the outer edges of his feet first, rolling inward gently, letting the weight of his body follow in silence. The forest floor became a language underfoot, each patch of moss a soft syllable, each dry twig a dangerous exclamation. He studied every texture, the forgiving cushion of pine needles, the treacherous crunch of frozen dirt, the echo of stone. He could tell by feel alone whether a step would betray him. At times, he removed his boots altogether, walking barefoot so that he might listen better. The ground spoke through the soles of his feet, cold, alive, honest. Moving quietly demanded patience beyond reason. He might cross a clearing slower than a crawling shadow, pausing between each step to let the world settle again. His heartbeat became his metronome. He timed his movements between gusts of wind or the chatter of birds. If a branch snapped, he froze, not out of fear, but respect. The wilderness punished arrogance. Noise was arrogance. The frontiersmen had learned that loud men did not live long. They scared the forest, and the forest, in turn, abandoned them. There was beauty in this discipline, a kind of sacred rhythm. At night, when the moon painted the world silver, he would move through the trees like a ghost of his own story. His breath was steady, his eyes wide, his hands brushing against barks, slick with dew. In those hours, he felt more alive than any sunrise could make him. The silence was not empty. It was full of whispers, of distant lives, of the world's unending murmur. He could hear the shifting of roots, the slow sigh of a sleeping bear, the soft ticking of snow melting on a branch. The quieter he became, the more he heard, and the more he understood that he was never truly alone. Sometimes, after days of travel, he would stop and listen to the echo of his own footsteps fading into memory. There was pride in that, not vanity, but communion. For a moment, he was not a trespasser or a survivor. He was part of the great breathing body of the earth. The soil accepted him. The trees watched but did not judge. The animals sensed his presence and did not flee. To walk silently was to be trusted, and in the frontier, trust from nature was the rarest gift of all. Years later, when men built railroads and the silence was broken by iron and smoke, the art was lost. Boots became heavy, steps careless, and the forest learned to fear the sound of humanity again. But for those who remember, for the few who still walk with respect and patience, the old rhythm remains. Every quiet step is a conversation with eternity. And somewhere, beneath the noise of the modern world, the earth still waits for men who know how to walk softly. When the sun bled into the mountains and the last light fell across the valley, the forest awoke in a language older than mankind. Night was no enemy to the frontiersman. It was his greatest teacher. In darkness, the world stripped itself of illusion. Trees became silhouettes of ancient gods. Rivers murmured secrets, and the wind spoke in tones only patience could decipher. To survive these nights, a man had to listen, not with his ears, but with his soul. The forest whispered warnings, comfort, and truth, if you were quiet enough to hear it. The frontiersman built his fire small, just enough to see the gleam of his knife and the steam from his breath. Flames to large invited company, both curious and deadly. He sat with his back to a fallen log, rifle close, hat pulled low. Around him, the night unfolded like a slow song. The owl began first, a deep, measured call that echoed through the trees. Then came the rustle of tiny feet in the brush, the soft whimper of a coyote far away, and the sighing of branches bending in the breeze. Each sound was part of a vast orchestra that played without conductor or stage. The forest did not need an audience. It performed because it was alive. He could tell the difference between every sound, a leaf falling from age or from fear, the slow shuffle of a bear versus the hurried skip of a rabbit. His heart learned to stay steady, to beat in rhythm with the night. Fear was not useful here, attention was. When the wind shifted, carrying a scent of smoke or wet fur, he knew what it meant. A hunter was near, or a storm approaching. The night told him everything, in whispers softer than thought. Sometimes, The whispers were kind. The crackle of fire soothed the loneliness that pressed on his ribs like the cold. The stars above, scattered across the sky like ash from creation, reminded him he was part of something vast and unknowable. The frontiersman did not pray in words. He prayed by listening. The rustling trees became his hymns, the running river his scripture. When he closed his eyes, he could almost hear the earth turning slow, ancient, patient. The night taught him humility, and in its quiet arms, he found a kind of peace no daylight could offer. But not every whisper was gentle. Sometimes the dark carried voices that didn't belong, the snap of something watching too closely, the soft cry of something that used to be human. The frontier was full of ghosts, not of men, but of moments. Every ridge and valley had stories buried in it. Hunters who never came back. Travelers swallowed by snow. Dreams that ended with a single misstep. The forest remembered them all. And when the wind moved through the trees just right, it carried their echoes, mingled with the living. The frontiersman never spoke back to those whispers. He just listened out of respect. For he knew that one day, when his fire finally went cold and his trail vanished into the dirt, his breath too would join that chorus. His story would drift through the same branches, the same riverbanks, the same eternal hush of night. And perhaps some other wanderer would pause, hear a faint whisper among the leaves, and think, I am not alone. For in the end, that was the secret the forest kept, that no one truly walked alone in the wilderness. Every sound, every shadow, every breath was connected. The night was not emptiness, it was memory. It was life continuing its quiet song long after the singers had gone. Before man tamed the land, he tamed the spark. The frontiersman knew that fire was not just warmth, it was existence itself. In the endless wilderness, where nights stretched cold and merciless, the flicker of flame was a heartbeat against the dark. Without it, meat stayed raw, water stayed frozen, and fear grew thick enough to choke on. He carried with him no luxury, only a pouch of flint, a small shard of steel, and faith in the old ritual that separated the living from the dead. He crouched low, hands trembling with the bite of wind, and searched for the right stone. Not any stone, but one with the spark trapped inside, flint, hard as memory, cold as truth. He struck it with his steel, once, twice, the sharp clang echoing through the still forest. Tiny sparks danced for a heartbeat before dying against damp moss. He tried again, slower this time. Patience was the real fuel of fire. The frontiersman breathed steadily, each motion deliberate, each failure a lesson. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Then crack. A single spark landed on the dry bark shavings he had gathered, glowing like an ember from heaven itself. He leaned close, whispering to it like a secret. Come on, little one. Don't die yet. The ember caught. Smoke coiled up, thin, fragile, alive. He fed it gently with curls of grass, chips of birch, and dry twigs no thicker than a finger. The small flame licked upward, growing cautious, then brave. The orange glow bloomed in the darkness, painting his face with life again. For a moment, it was as if he had stolen a piece of the sun. The cold retreated, shadows softened, and the night itself seemed to sigh in surrender. He stared into that fire the way a man stares into his own soul. It was mesmerizing, beautiful, dangerous, hungry. Fire was a friend that demanded respect. Feed it wrong, and it would die. Feed it too much, and it would destroy. The frontiersman had seen both ends of that truth. He'd watched forests turn to ashes when a careless flame got loose. He'd seen men freeze because they were too proud to learn the patience of kindling. Fire didn't forgive ignorance. It rewarded understanding. As the flame grew steady, he felt something ancient stir inside him, a connection to every soul that had ever struck stone against steel. From the first cave dwellers to his own calloused hands. This was the oldest language of survival, the same ritual repeated for millennia. The sparks were prayers, and the flame was the answer. Each night he made one. He felt less like a wanderer and more like a part of the eternal chain of humanity that refused to be extinguished. The forest around him glowed with the reflection of his small victory. Smoke rose like a signal to the stars. The wind danced through the trees, scattering embers that blinked like fireflies before fading into the dark. And though he was alone, he no longer felt lonely. Fire had that power. It was company, memory, and warmth woven together. He sat beside it until his eyes grew heavy, letting the steady crackle lull him to rest. Tomorrow would bring new battles, hunger, cold, perhaps rain. But tonight there was fire. And as long as the flame lived, so would he. Because in the heart of every spark lay the same message whispered across centuries: you are not finished yet. Rain was the cruelest test of a man's will. It stripped warmth from the bones, soaked the soul, and laughed at every spark that dared to live. For the frontiersman, rain meant more than discomfort. It was a battle between patience and despair. Yet those who roamed the wild knew one sacred rule: if you can build fire in the rain, you can outlast anything. The storm always came without mercy, clouds like bruises gathering in the sky, wind hissing through the trees. When the first drops struck his hat, the frontiersman was already moving. Every second mattered. He searched for shelter, not from fear, but strategy. A fallen tree, a rocky overhang, a hollow between roots where the earth itself might lend him protection. He knelt in the mud, hands numb and shaking, pulling bark from a dead birch. Beneath the wet surface, hidden from the rain's reach, lay dry fibers, thin and pale, like veins of forgotten sunlight. He peeled them carefully, whispering to himself, as if reciting an old prayer. You hide your fire on the inside, he murmured, just like a man. From his pouch, he drew his flint and steel, blackened, scarred, but faithful. Around him, the rain sang its cold song, each drop a reminder that failure meant death. He built his nest of dry bark inside a small hollow, shielded by his coat and the curve of his hands. Smoke would betray him to nothing but the storm. He struck the steel once, twice, sparks scattered and died against the damp air. He struck again, slower this time, his breath steady, his eyes unblinking. The rain fell harder, as if mocking his defiance. And then, at last, a single spark caught. It clung to the birch fibers, like hope clings to the desperate. He bent close, breathing life into it. Come on, live. The ember glowed red, fragile as a heartbeat. He fed it dry moss hidden inside his pack, the last of it saved for nights like this. Smoke rose, hesitant and gray. A thin flame licked upward, shivering against the wind. The frontiersman cupped his hands around it, his palms steaming with heat and rain. When the flame finally steadied, it was not just fire, it was victory. It was proof that willpower could defeat even the sky itself. As the rain poured, the fire hissed and spat, yet it lived. He built a small wall of stones to protect it, feeding it carefully, twigs first, then branches stripped of their wet bark. The steam that rose smelled of earth and courage. Soon, warmth spread through the hollow, pushing the cold back like a retreating army. His hands thawed. His face, streaked with rain, glowed orange with triumph. The storm roared, but it no longer scared him. Fire had no fear. Fire had memory of every man who had refused to freeze, every spark that refused to die. He cooked what little he had, a scrap of dried meat, a handful of roots, and ate in silence. Above him, thunder rolled through the sky like a god's laughter. But the frontiersman only smiled. The rain could take his comfort, his food, his strength, but not his flame. He had mastered the one truth every wanderer must learn, that survival is not about fighting nature, but persuading it. By morning, the storm had passed. His fire still smoldered, small but proud, a red jewel against the soaked black earth. He stirred it gently, watching the smoke rise into the soft dawn. And though the world was wet and cold, inside him burned something no rain could ever touch, the unkillable spark of endurance. Smoke was more than the breath of fire. It was the voice of survival. For the frontiersman, smoke carried stories farther than his feet ever could. It spoke to the heavens, to other wanderers, to the mountains themselves. A thin gray column rising against the sky could mean many things: danger, warmth, and yet, to those who knew the code, it was a message written in air. Smoke was the frontiersman's messenger, his companion, and at times, his confession. When he built his fire each night, he did not simply light it for warmth. He watched how the smoke rose. Straight and thin meant clear weather. Wild and twisting meant rain or wind on the way. He had learned that the forest breathed differently each day. Some nights, the smoke would drift low, clinging to the ground as if unwilling to leave him. On others, it soared high, stretching toward the stars, like a prayer freed from a weary chest. He read those signs as carefully as a priest reads scripture. The wilderness spoke through the color of the smoke, through its shape and scent. Thick black smoke meant wet wood or danger. Blue-gray smoke meant good burn, dry heart. Sometimes he used it to speak. When other travelers roamed nearby, hunters, trappers, or lost men like him, a single column of smoke meant peace. Two meant trouble. 3 short bursts, made by smothering the flame with a blanket, meant help. It was the Morse code of the forgotten world, practiced by men who could not afford to shout. The forest carried sound only so far, but the sky saw everything, yet the flame itself, that was his truest friend. Fire did not judge or question, it listened. It answered hunger, fear, and loneliness with warmth. The frontiersman often found himself speaking to it, not out of madness, but gratitude. The crackle of burning wood sounded like laughter after days of silence. When rain pinned him down, or snow wrapped the world in white, fire became his only reminder that life still moved. It was a living thing, fragile, demanding, loyal. It ate what he gave and died if he neglected it. He treated it like a companion, not a tool. Sometimes, when he looked into the flames, he saw faces, the memory of people long gone, flickering in the orange dance. His mother's smile, the faces of old friends lost to rivers or bullets, ghosts of a world he once called home. The fire became a storyteller, pulling memories from the smoke like spirits rising from the earth. It reminded him that though the frontier was lonely, he was never truly alone. Every flame ever kindled carried pieces of all who came before. One night, while camped in a valley, he saw another plume of smoke rise in the distance. A stranger's fire. For a long time, he stared at it across the miles. Two souls, separated by wilderness, connected by a single thread of smoke. No words were spoken, no paths crossed, yet something unspoken passed between them, the quiet acknowledgement that both had survived another day. In a world where everything tried to kill you, that was communion. As dawn came, he stirred the ashes and let the fire die gently, like a friend being laid to rest. The smoke rose one last time, curling upward in a thin spiral before fading into the golden sky. He watched it disappear with the kind of respect a man gives to things that saved his life more than once. Because out here, the frontiersman had learned a simple truth. The fire may end, but the smoke always finds its way home. When hunger came, and it always came, the frontiersman didn't complain. Hunger was a companion as constant as the wind. But out in the wilderness, there were no pots, no pans, no cast-iron comforts. There was only the earth, the flame, and the wit of a man who refused to starve. Cooking without a pot was not a skill. It was a ritual born of desperation and craft. Each meal was a small rebellion against the wild's attempt to erase him. He began with stone, flat, heavy, patient, the kind that held heat like a secret. He placed it near the fire, letting it soak up the flame's fury until it shimmered red in the low light. The forest filled with the scent of pine smoke and damp soil. From his pouch, he pulled what little food he had, a rabbit caught in his snare, maybe a few roots dug from frozen earth. With a blade worn dull from years of use, he cleaned the meat, humming low as he worked. There was a rhythm to it, a kind of grace. The forest watched in silence, its breath hanging thick in the air. He laid the meat on the stone, the fat sizzling instantly, hissing like whispers from the fire. The smell of cooking flesh curled into the cold air, rich, smoky, and full of promise. He turned it slowly, not rushing, not wasting. The crackle of fire became music. The smell became memory. Sometimes he added herbs gathered from the forest floor, wild mint, pine needles, or berries crushed for flavor. The wilderness was his pantry, and every meal tasted of resilience. When he had no stone, he used wood, green logs, split and placed near the flame until they steamed but didn't burn. He hollowed the wood with his knife, turning it into a crude bowl. Into it, he poured water from a stream and dropped in hot rocks from the fire. The water hissed, boiled, and danced. That was how he made soup, the ancient way, the hard way, the same method his ancestors might have used before iron ever touched the earth. There were days when even that was too much. Days when rain soaked every stick. Then he buried his food. He wrapped meat in wet clay, sealing it tight, and placed it directly into the coals. Hours later, when the clay hardened, he cracked it open to reveal tender meat steamed in its own juices, the dirt-roasted feast of the wild. The smell alone could make a starving man weep. He ate with reverence, never greed. Every bite was a reminder that the land gave only to those who respected it. He wasted nothing. Bones became broth, fat became fuel, skin became thread. The forest provided, but only if you asked with humility. Around his fire, meals were sacred. They were not about taste or comfort, but about proof. Proof that man could outthink the elements, that life could be coaxed from the harshest corners of existence. When the meal was done, he leaned back against his pack, chewing slowly, letting the last bits of warmth fade from the firestone. His stomach filled, his mind calmed, and for a brief moment, the world was kind. The stars above seemed to lean closer, their cold light softened by the rising smoke. He was still a wanderer, still a stranger in this endless wild. But tonight he had eaten Dot. Night in the frontier was not darkness, it was depth, a vast, breathing thing that swallowed the world whole. The forest went quiet, the air turned colder than thought, and every sound, the crack of a twig, the sigh of wind through pine, became a language of its own. In that world of silence and shadow, the fire was the only light, the only companion that did not sleep. It flickered and hissed, its small flames painting gold on the bark of trees, turning the frontiersman's face into a sculpture of light and memory. He sat close to it, knees drawn up, coat pulled tight. His rifle rested beside him, his knife gleamed in the soft glow. But for now, there was no danger, only the quiet watch between man and fire. This was the vigil, the ritual that had kept wanderers alive since the beginning of time. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was awareness. It kept beasts at bay, yes, but it also kept madness away. In the endless dark, where the mind could wander into fear, the fire was a tether, a reminder that life still burned, even when the world felt dead. Each crackle from the wood was a heartbeat. The flame bent and whispered secrets he would never tell another soul. Sometimes he thought the fire could speak, not in words, but in feeling. It reminded him of things he had forgotten, laughter from a cabin long gone, the voice of someone who once waited for him, the comfort of a hearth that was no longer his. The wilderness took everything from a man, his comfort, his safety, even his name. But the fire gave something back. It gave him presence. It said, "You are still here." As the night deepened, the stars began their slow dance overhead. He looked up, eyes reflecting the heavens, and felt the strange balance of smallness and strength. Around him stretched endless miles of forest and silence. Yet here, in this tiny circle of warmth and light, he ruled a kingdom. The wolves might howl in the distance, the wind might test his courage, but as long as that flame lived, he was not afraid. He fed it gently, one branch at a time, never too much, never too little, like tending a living friend who needed care. There were nights when exhaustion called him to sleep, but he dared not fully close his eyes. The fire was his sentry. He dozed lightly, waking at the softest sputter. When the flames waned, he stirred the embers, coaxing them back to life with a breath and a spark. It was a delicate balance, man guarding fire, and fire guarding man, to living things, bound by need and respect, before dawn. When the air turned sharp and the forest began to hum again with life, he would let the fire die slowly, never abruptly. That would be disrespectful. He covered the embers with ash, watching the red glow fade like the last light of a loyal friend. Smoke curled upward one final time, thin and ghost-like, and vanished into the pale morning sky. He whispered his thanks, the way his father once did, a quiet prayer not to God, but to the flame itself. And as he shouldered his pack and stepped back into the wild, the ashes still smoked faintly behind him, proof that he had lived another night, that he had kept his vigil, that he had burned quietly against the vast cold of the world. The earth had a language, one older than speech, written not with ink, but with motion. Every creature that walked, crawled, or slithered across it left behind a signature, a message pressed into soil and snow. The frontiersman learned to read it the way poets read verses, not for beauty, but for truth. To survive out here, he had to become part detective, part priest, and part ghost. When he walked through the forest at dawn, he didn't just see ground. He saw a story unfolding at his feet. The crushed grass, the faint drag of a hoof, the shallow dip where dew no longer clung. To most men, it was nothing. To him, it was scripture. A deer had passed here an hour ago, light-footed and wary. The bent twig at shoulder height meant a fox had darted through. A line of paw prints, spaced too far apart, told him of a wolf running fast, maybe chasing, maybe fleeing. The world whispered its secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. He knelt and touched the soil, letting the texture speak. If it was warm, the trail was fresh. If cold and dry, the quarry was gone. Sometimes he lifted a leaf and smelled it, the musk of fir, the trace of fear or hunger that lingered like perfume. Tracking wasn't about eyes. It was about intuition, sharpened by silence. It was the art of seeing what wasn't there, a broken pattern, a shadow that shouldn't be, the absence of birdsong where danger waited. The earth was his book, and every print, every scrape of claw, every droplet of blood on a stone was a sentence. He read it in real time, his mind constructing scenes invisible to others. A family of elk crossing at dawn, a cougar lying in wait near a ridge. The chase, the struggle, the kill, all written without words. And through that language, he learned humility, because the land didn't care if he understood it or not. It had been speaking long before man arrived. He followed a trail, once faint, half-yearsed by wind, that led him for miles through pine and shadow. He didn't know what he was chasing, only that something larger than instinct pulled him forward. When he found the end, it wasn't an animal at all, but the remnants of another man's campfire, old, cold, forgotten. A few boot prints in the mud, half swallowed by rain. The hunter had been here before him, maybe weeks ago, maybe years. For a moment, he felt the strange comfort of kinship to ghosts crossing paths through time, both reading the same ancient script. In winter, when snow fell thick, tracking became a meditation. Each step pressed into the white, like a heartbeat against silence. The forest turned into a blank page, and every mark mattered. He could follow a hare for hours just to see where it went, not to kill it, but to understand its world. The patterns of survival were written everywhere in the twist of a branch, the depth of a footprint, the way silence spread before a storm. Sometimes, when he camped at night and the fire crackled low, he would draw lines in the dirt, mimicking the tracks he'd seen, testing himself to remember. It wasn't a hobby, it was a devotion, because to read the earth was to belong to it, and in that belonging, he found something more than survival. He found meaning. For the wilderness spoke only one truth. those who listen to the ground will never be lost. The frontiersman understood that the wilderness never rushed. Every creature out here moved according to the rhythm of hunger, wind, and caution. Nothing more, nothing less. To track them, he had to match that rhythm. Patience was his greatest weapon, sharper than any blade. Those who hurried went home empty, or didn't go home at all. The forest rewarded only those who could wait, breathe, and disappear. He rose before the first light, when the air still held the chill of dreams, and the world was neither night nor day. Moving slowly, he followed faint prints through the frost. The trail wove between pines, across a frozen creek, and into shadowed brush. Every sound mattered. The sigh of his breath, the creak of leather, the distant caw of a raven announcing dawn. He stopped often, not to rest, but to listen. The wilderness spoke softly, and impatience made a man deaf. Tracking was never a straight line. It was a dance of hesitation, a pause here, a step there, a lean to catch the glint of disturbed grass. Sometimes the trail vanished completely. That was when most men gave up. But he knew that every disappearance was an illusion. The animal was still ahead, only smarter now, aware of pursuit. That was when he became the shadow, slow, deliberate, invisible. He lowered his heartbeat, softened his gaze, and thought like prey. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, turning the frost to silver mist. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. Hunger sharpened his focus. A broken twig on a low branch, a clue. Fresh scat steaming on the ground, another. He could sense it now, a deer, nervous and quick, moving through the trees not far ahead. He crouched, studying the angle of each print, the width of each step. They told him everything, when it last stopped, when it spooked, how heavy it was. The forest was a book of details written in patience. He followed until the trail led into a thicket. There, he waited, not minutes, hours. The trick was stillness. He became a rock among rocks, a root among roots. The wind moved around him as if he wasn't there. And in that stillness, something sacred happened. Time lost its shape. The chirp of birds faded. The world grew smaller, quieter. His mind emptied until only the rhythm of the land remained. That was the secret to tracking. You didn't chase the animal. You waited until the land allowed it to appear. When the deer finally stepped into view, it was as if it had materialized from thin air, a creature of breath and light. Its ears flicked, its hooves pressed soft into the snow. He could have taken it then, ended the hunt. But sometimes he didn't. Sometimes he watched, letting it pass, because the lesson was worth more than the meat. He had proven patience could summon life from silence. That was enough. As dusk fell, he turned back toward camp, footprints weaving behind him like verses in an old story. The forest had tested him again and found him worthy. In that test, he felt a strange peace. The wild didn't owe him anything, yet it had shared its rhythm. He had followed shadows and found understanding, patience that was the true hunt. The kill was only the echo. The frontiersman knew that the ground beneath his feet was a living map, one that recorded every triumph and tragedy the forest had ever seen. To most, a track was just an impression in the dirt, but to him, it was a heartbeat, a confession, sometimes even an obituary. The earth remembered everything, where a fox leaped, where a bear limped, where a deer ran and never came back. Every track spoke if a man knew how to listen. He moved through the clearing like a scholar through sacred texts, his eyes tracing the symbols left behind by life's quiet struggle. Here, a shallow print with a sharp toe mark, a rabbit. There, a heavier track, wide and deep, claws etched at the front, a wolf. The story was clear. Hunter and hunted, separated by minutes. He followed the path, reading the changes in depth, direction, and spacing. The rabbit's prints zigzagged wildly, panicked. The wolf's became longer, faster, relentless. Then, suddenly, both trails vanished into a swirl of disturbed snow and scattered fur. Silence. The story had ended. He knelt there for a long moment, fingertips brushing the cold evidence. This was how the wilderness spoke of death, quietly, without judgment. Out here, death was not cruelty. It was order. The forest fed itself, one heartbeat at a time. The wolf would live another night. The rabbit would feed the soil, and the cycle would go on, unwitnessed but eternal. He had learned not to mourn such moments, but to respect them, because in the end, every creature, even man, left only tracks behind. Sometimes he found tracks of men. Those were different. Boots pressed deeper, heavier, as if burdened by thought. Human trails always looked impatient, erratic, the sign of creatures who fought the land instead of flowing with it. He could tell their stories too. A print turned inward meant fatigue. Uneven spacing meant injury. Once, he followed a lone set of boot tracks for 2 miles, only to find them end abruptly at a riverbank. The current had washed the rest away. He stared at the empty water and wondered, had the man crossed, or had the river taken him? In the wilderness, both answers were equally likely. He kept a small journal tucked into his pack, a collection of sketches and notes, not words of glory or conquest, but of footprints, claw marks, and feather traces. The forest was a book, and he was merely its scribe. At night, by the fire, he would flip through the pages, each drawing reminding him that he was not alone in this vast expanse. There was an order to it all, a rhythm of life and loss written across the soil. There was beauty in the impermanence of it. By morning, the wind would erase what had been written. Snow would cover it, rain would blur it, and the forest would begin its story anew. That was the wisdom the tracks whispered to him. Nothing lasts, but everything matters. Even the faintest mark left meaning, even if it was gone by dawn. As twilight fell, he stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. Below, the land stretched endless and indifferent. But he smiled, because he knew if he were to die here tomorrow, the earth would remember him too. His steps would press into the soil, his story would mingle with the dust, and for a while, the wilderness would speak his name through the prints he left behind. There came a point in every hunt when the world simply went silent. The tracks that had led him for miles ended abruptly, swallowed by wind or rain or chance. For the frontiersman, that moment was both dread and revelation. To lose a trail was to stand on the edge of the known world and peer into mystery. Most men cursed when the prints faded. He only breathed deeper. The earth had not betrayed him. It was testing his faith. He knelt where the last sign vanished. A single bent blade of grass trembled in the breeze, the only witness to what had passed. The soil held no shape, the snow no indentation. It was as if the creature or the man had stepped clean out of existence. He studied the place like a priest studies silence, searching not for answers, but for understanding. The wilderness did not always give what was asked of it. Sometimes it demanded surrender. When the trail disappeared, other senses awoke. Sound, scent, intuition. He listened for the faint scrape of bark, the hush of wings, the sigh of disturbed air. He watched how the wind moved the trees, how birds shifted in rhythm, how the forest itself seemed to lean in one direction. The lost trail was never truly lost. It had only changed language. To find it again, he had to unlearn logic and remember instinct. Hours passed. The sky dimmed from silver to pewter, the light thinning between the trees. Most men would have turned back, but he moved slower, smaller, letting the forest lead. He noticed a cluster of moss, darker than the rest, perhaps crushed under weight. A single spiderweb torn and glistening, perhaps brushed by fur. He followed these whispers, faint as breath, until new signs emerged. A broken twig, a shallow print softened by rain. The trail had returned, but so had humility. The wilderness reminded him that persistence mattered more than pride. Sometimes, though, the trail never came back. Then he would stop completely, build a small fire, and sit in its circle of warmth until the night swallowed everything else. Losing the trail was not failure, it was education. It taught him to accept uncertainty, to respect the limits of knowing. Out here, even the best eyes could be fooled, and even the surest steps could wander. What mattered was the stillness between them, the willingness to listen when the land refused to speak. He remembered once tracking a wounded elk through 3 days of fog. The prints grew faint, the blood trail vanished, and the forest seemed to erase itself behind him. On the 4th morning, he found not the elk but its antler, shed long before, half buried in moss. He took it as a gift, not a loss. The hunt had ended, not with capture, but with understanding. Everything that lives leaves something behind, even when its path is gone. When dawn finally broke, he rose from his fire, brushed the ash from his coat, and looked out over the valley. The fog lifted slowly, revealing new tracks he had not seen before, fresh, clear, leading east. He smiled. The wilderness had simply been waiting for him to slow down enough to see again. He stepped forward, careful, respectful, grateful. The lesson of the lost trail stayed with him always. When the path disappears, the journey truly begins. There came a day when the frontiersmen realized the truth every hunter must face, that the forest watches too. The same ground he studied so carefully was also studying him. His boot prints pressed deep into the snow. His scent drifted through the pines. His campfire smoke curled into the wind like a signal. Out here, nothing went unseen. The wilderness remembered every trespass, every step, every heartbeat. And sometimes the tracker became the trail. It started as a feeling, a shiver that wasn't caused by the cold. He was following the tracks of a wolf through the high country, a heavy snowfall covering the ground like blank parchment. The prints were fresh, wide, steady. The wolf was alone. But after hours of pursuit, he noticed something strange. The tracks behind him were no longer just his own. Another pair joined them, human, lighter, faster. Someone was following. He stopped and listened. Nothing, only the whisper of falling snow. Yet the silence was wrong, too heavy, too deliberate. The forest was holding its breath. He crouched low, eyes scanning the white horizon. His own trail stretched behind him. Like a confession, each footprint a glowing mark against the untouched snow. He realized then how much he had revealed, the places he paused, the direction he looked, even his state of mind. Every tracker left pieces of themselves behind. Someone had learned to read him as he read the earth. Night came fast. He built a small fire under a rock outcropping, shielding it from view. The flames flickered low, whispering against the wind. His rifle rested across his knees, his eyes on the dark beyond the circle of light. Snow fell thicker now, muting every sound. He thought about the wolf. Perhaps it had sensed him too. Perhaps it had doubled back. The wilderness didn't play by human rules. Sometimes predator and prey were decided not by strength, but by awareness. As the hours crawled on, faint sounds reached him. A crunch, a pause, another crunch. Whoever followed was close. He smothered the fire and waited, letting darkness swallow him. The world turned to shades of gray. He could hear his own heart, steady but loud. The snow revealed faint movement, a shadow crossing between trees. For a moment, he glimpsed a figure, fur-lined hood, rifle glinting faintly, eyes sharp and patient. Another tracker, maybe a hunter, maybe something worse. He didn't move. The forest became his ally again, silent, watchful, infinite. He let the man pass, following his own footprints forward, unaware he had been seen. The frontiersman watched until the shadow vanished into the storm. Then, slowly, he stood and walked the opposite way, erasing his tracks with the heel of his boot as he went. The snow would finish the job by dawn. The trail, all of it, was gone. His, the wolf's, the stranger's. The mountain stood blank once more. The world reset. He stopped and looked back over the white expanse, feeling a strange calm. There was no victory here, no defeat, only understanding. In the end, every tracker is hunted by something. Another man, a beast, or the silence within. He smiled faintly, pulling his coat tighter. The snowflakes melted on his beard, the cold biting his cheeks like memory. As he disappeared into the timberline, he left nothing behind but the whisper of a lesson written in snow. Those who follow the world too closely will one day find it following them. The forest was generous but unforgiving. To survive, the frontiersman had to do more than hunt or track. He had to build a home from nothing, a sanctuary in a place that wished him gone. And the first lesson of shelter was location. Choosing a site was not about convenience. It was about reading the land as carefully as a book. Every slope, every tree, every wind pattern carried meaning. One wrong decision, and the night could kill you. He walked slowly through a clearing, eyes scanning every detail. The soil, damp or dry, the angle of a hill, the shadow of nearby cliffs. Too close to water, and you risked flooding. Too deep in a ravine, and the wind funneled like a blade. Too open, and predators could see you before you saw them. He studied the ground for signs of animals, old burrows, fallen branches, hidden rocks, each clue a hint to the land's temperament. Nature was both host and judge, and he needed its approval. After an hour of careful assessment, he found a spot, a slight rise with sheltering pines on 3 sides, a stream a safe distance below, flat soil to anchor his structure. The forest seemed to nod in silent acknowledgement. He knelt, pressing fingers into the dirt, smelling the earth, feeling its warmth and resilience. Here, he thought, The wind would pass without knocking him down. The rain would drain safely. The fire could breathe without smoke choking the entrance. The site was alive, and alive places favored careful observers. He imagined the shelter before building it, a mental blueprint of walls, roof, hearth, and door. Every decision mattered. He would use fallen timber, moss, and stone, blending his creation into the landscape so that it would not stand out to the curious eyes of wolves or humans. Concealment was protection. Efficiency was survival, and the ground itself dictated much of the design. Uneven soil demanded reinforced support. Soft moss could line the walls for insulation. In every gesture, the land guided him. The frontiersman's movements were precise and deliberate. He tested branches for strength, checking for rot with the tap of a knife. He gathered materials only as needed, respecting the rhythm of the forest. This was not labor. It was communion. Every log placed, every branch interwoven, every layer of moss added was an act of respect for the land that provided him life. Shelter was not domination of nature. It was negotiation, compromise, and artistry. By evening, he had mapped out the perimeter. Stones marked corners, logs were laid in preparation, moss collected for bedding and insulation. He stepped back to assess his work. Already, the forest around him felt different, safer, balanced, aligned. He would sleep under its protection tonight, alive because of choices made with care and foresight. To the frontiersman, the right site was more than convenience. It was hope, it was wisdom, it was survival written in the contours of the earth. At the firelight, he traced the future walls with his eyes, imagining how wind would pass, how snow would accumulate, how predators might approach. This was not merely shelter, it was mastery without arrogance. And in the quiet dusk, he knew that the forest had already accepted him here, a temporary guest, yet one who had listened long enough to earn trust. Once the site was chosen, the frontiersman began the careful work of shaping the forest into a shelter. Every wall, every layer of moss, every notch in timber was deliberate. In the wilderness, mistakes were punished swiftly. A poorly stacked log could collapse under snow. Gaps in walls could invite cold, wind, or predators. Survival demanded precision, patience, and respect. He selected fallen logs first, thick, sturdy, and free from rot. Each log was inspected, tapped with a knife, and lifted with slow, measured effort. The forest seemed to watch as he worked, shadows shifting with his movements. Placement mattered. Logs were aligned to follow the slope of the land, ensuring water would run away from the foundation. He dug small trenches, placing stones beneath logs for drainage, keeping the base dry. Moisture was the enemy, and the forest offered silent guidance in choosing the right spots. Next came the insulation. Moss, soft yet resilient, was stripped carefully from the forest floor, leaving roots intact whenever possible to preserve the ecosystem. It would fill gaps between logs, sealing the shelter from drafts while absorbing residual moisture. The act was ritualistic, hands brushing away dirt, placing moss like a sacred garment over the structure, pressing it gently to hold warmth. He worked slowly, aware that each layer was life-saving. The forest whispered, approving in rustles and bird calls, and he moved in harmony with its rhythms. Corners received extra attention. Logs were not merely stacked, they were interlocked, their weight balanced like the bones of a living creature. Moss was tucked into every crack, offering cushioning against wind and cold. Each movement was deliberate. Lift, position, inspect, adjust. The frontiersmen treated each log as both a shield and a companion, understanding that the forest provided material, but skill made it safe. Throughout the day, sweat and wood dust mingled, filling the air with the smell of pine and earth. He paused occasionally to scan the surroundings, ensuring predators remained unseen, that no human trail led too close. The act of building was both labor and meditation. Time slowed. The rhythm of lifting, placing, and sealing became a kind of chant, a song without sound, connecting him to every forebear who had ever built shelter in the wild. By evening, the walls stood firm, solid, and warm, even before the roof was added. He leaned against the timber, feeling its weight, its protection. The gaps were minimal. The moss glowed faintly in the last light, a cushion between him and the chill. Even without fire, the walls promised safety. With care, skill, and patience, he had transformed raw forest into a haven. Shelter was not merely protection, it was mastery, practiced humbly. Every log, every moss layer, every corner told a story of observation, endurance, and respect. The forest had provided the tools. He had provided the diligence. Together, they created a home that could endure wind, snow, and night. And for the frontiersman, that was the true measure of survival. Not merely staying alive, but living wisely within the world's raw architecture. As the sun sank below the trees, he stood back to admire his work. A small fortress of logs and moss nestled into the landscape, a testament to knowledge, patience, and instinct. The forest had granted permission, and in that moment, he felt the rare, quiet satisfaction of harmony, the unspoken understanding between man and wilderness. Walls could hold warmth, but without a roof, the wilderness would still seep inside. Rain, snow, and wind could undo hours of work in moments. The frontiersman knew this. The roof was not decoration, it was survival, the thin barrier that separated life from peril. Every branch, every layer of bark, every weave of moss mattered. He scoured the surrounding forest for the right timber long, straight branches, sturdy enough to bear snow, but flexible enough to bend. Each piece was examined, tapped with a knife, weighed in hand. Then came the framing, a skeleton of interlocking branches, angled carefully so water would run off, not seep in. He dug small notches to secure beams, using rope fashioned from bark fibers when necessary. Precision was survival. The wrong angle, the wrong alignment, and the roof could collapse under the first heavy snow. Next, he layered smaller twigs, creating a lattice that would support insulation. Over the lattice went bark, stripped carefully from fallen trees, and moss, gathered with meticulous care. Moss was both padding and sealant, filling cracks and preventing drafts. He pressed each layer with hands numb from wind and cold, listening to the forest around him, the wind, the birds, the rustling underbrush. The wilderness was the ultimate engineer. He was its apprentice, learning through observation, trial, and patience. He paused often, looking up at his work. The roof rose like a gentle slope, blending seamlessly with the tree canopy above. From below, it looked almost natural, as though the forest itself had grown a shelter just for him. But he knew the truth. It was man, careful and persistent, shaping nature into safety without arrogance. As the afternoon faded into evening, snow began to fall lightly. He tested the roof, pressing branches and watching moss settle. The snow rested lightly, no cracks, no collapse. He felt a rare surge of relief. For a man in the wilderness, a roof was more than protection, it was freedom. The walls kept predators at bay, but the roof allowed him to sleep soundly through storms, to keep fire inside, to wake to a world softened by snow without fear of drowning in it. The final touch was the interior lining gaps with extra moss, reinforcing weak points with small twigs. He ensured the entrance faced away from prevailing winds and that the ridge could drain runoff quickly. Every detail was considered, every imperfection corrected. When complete, the shelter seemed to breathe with the forest, a compact fortress harmonized with its environment. The frontiersman stepped back, hands on knees, examining his work from every angle. The sun had sunk low, casting long shadows through the pines. He imagined the nights to come, storms, wind, snow, cold, and the warmth of his creation holding him safe. The forest could rage, the fire could flicker and fail, but the roof, this careful construct of wood, bark, and moss, would endure in that moment. He understood something elemental. Survival was not only about strength or courage, but about understanding, observation, and respect. The forest provided, and man shaped. Together, they created a fragile equilibrium, a sanctuary against the vast, indifferent wilderness. A shelter without fire was just a hollow in the forest. The hearth was its heart, radiating warmth, light, and survival. The frontiersman knew that fire in the wilderness was both tool and guardian. He could cook, dry clothes, boil water, and defend against predators. But more than that, it gave him presence, a pulse of humanity in a silent, indifferent world. He began with stones, carefully selected for heat, retention, and stability. Large, flat rocks formed the base. Smaller ones encircled the perimeter. The fire would sit here, safe from collapsing logs and loose moss. He dug a shallow pit, lined it with clay he gathered from nearby streams, pressing it smooth to prevent sparks from reaching the wooden floor. The process was meticulous. Any misstep could destroy hours of careful work. Next, he collected kindling, dry pine needles, thin branches, shredded bark. The forest gave him just enough. He never took more than necessary. He arranged the materials in a tight nest, understanding the flow of air, the way flame would climb and spread. Sparks could betray him to predators, so the fire was a cautious, almost sacred creation. He struck flint against steel, sparks dancing, until the first ember caught. Breath by breath, he nurtured it, coaxing life from a cold spark. As flames rose, he adjusted logs, adding layers slowly. The fire was not wild. It was disciplined, dancing in rhythm with the shelter. He added moss as insulation around the pit, ensuring no heat escaped unnecessarily. The smell of burning pine filled the air, a fragrance of security and solitude. He watched the flames carefully, understanding their language. High flickers meant dry air, smoke thickened with damp wood, and a steady orange glow signaled balance. The hearth became a multifunctional center. He hung a small metal pot over the fire, with a tripod of forked branches. Boiling water collected from the stream. Dried roots and meats would cook here, providing nourishment for days. He dried clothes by the edges, letting warmth seep into damp fibers. Even in the middle of a snowstorm, the shelter radiated life, a microcosm of civilization held in balance with the wilderness. Beyond practicality, the hearth offered psychological sanctuary. Flames flickering against the roof's moss and logs provided companionship. In the long, silent nights, staring into the fire was a meditation, a reminder that he survived not by chance, but by skill. Each crackle and hiss was affirmation, proof that knowledge and patience had shaped this small world into safety. By evening, the shelter hummed with warmth. Smoke drifted through a small, controlled vent in the roof, carrying the scent of pine and earth into the open air without betraying the location. He leaned against the wall, eyes on the dancing flames, listening to the forest beyond, feeling the pulse of his own heartbeat align with the fire's rhythm. The hearth was not merely survival, it was civilization carved out of wilderness, a testament to observation, care, and respect. The frontiersmen understood that, in the wilderness, fire was sacred. It could not be rushed, forced, or neglected. It demanded patience and attention, but in return, it gave safety, warmth, sustenance, and a small, glowing heartbeat in the heart of the forest. The shelter stood firm, walls interlocked, roof sealed, hearth burning softly. But even the sturdiest structure needed final touches. Doors, concealment, and security transformed a simple shelter into a fortress of survival. The frontiersmen knew that the wilderness had eyes, ears, and patience. Every gap left unchecked could spell danger. Every careless noise could attract unwanted attention. He began with the door, not an ornate piece, but a functional barrier. 2 thick planks, bound with strips of rawhide, created a swinging panel that fit snugly into the frame. A small wooden latch held it in place. The door served many purposes: privacy, wind protection, and the first line of defense against curious animals. He tested it repeatedly, listening for creaks, adjusting hinges, reinforcing weak points. It had to move smoothly, yet remain secure. An engineering challenge solved with patience and precision. Next came camouflage. Moss from surrounding trees, bark, and pine needles were applied carefully to the exterior walls and roof edges. The shelter blended into the forest almost seamlessly, visible only on close inspection. The forest itself became a shield. The shelter was no longer a stark intruder, but part of the landscape. He even brushed snow and leaves strategically, ensuring tracks leading to the door were minimized. Survival, he knew, depended as much on invisibility as on strength. He inspected potential threats. Predators might approach at night. Humans could wander nearby. He dug small trenches to direct rainwater away, but also to mask footprints and slow intruders. Rocks and low branches were placed strategically, creating minor obstacles without alerting those who walked past. Every detail of the shelter communicated caution and respect. It did not dominate the forest. It coexisted with it. Finally, he considered the interior. The hearth remained central. Logs and moss reinforced where wear occurred, and sleeping areas were slightly elevated on compacted soil covered with moss for warmth and drainage. Items were stored efficiently: weapons, tools, and dried food within arm's reach, minimizing movement in the dark. Organization was not luxury, it was survival. Each motion inside the shelter was deliberate, rehearsed, disciplined. He paused outside, looking at his creation in the soft twilight. From the ridge above, the structure could barely be distinguished from fallen trees and natural moss patches. From below, smoke rose subtly from the hearth, curling upward and disappearing into the forest canopy. The frontiersman smiled faintly. This was not just shelter, it was knowledge incarnate. Every log, every moss layer, every careful detail embodied lessons learned through decades of observation, patience, and trial. In the wilderness, mastery was ephemeral. A storm could test the walls. A predator could investigate the shadows. A fire could die. Yet through skill, respect, and care, a man could carve safety out of chaos. And tonight, as he stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned by the hearth, he felt a profound satisfaction. The forest was still vast and wild, but he had earned a place within it, a sanctuary built not by brute strength, but by understanding, patience, and reverence. Every survivalist knew the truth. Life was temporary, and so was shelter. But excellence in preparation meant that the wilderness could not take everything. And in that simple, sturdy, camouflaged home, the frontiersman had found temporary victory against the vastness beyond. In the wilderness, a man without tools was a man without options. The frontiersman knew that survival depended not just on courage or strength, but on the ability to create implements from the raw world itself. Stones, bones, wood, and sinew could all be transformed into tools capable of hunting, cooking, and defense. What the modern world took for granted, axes, knives, hammers, had to be reinvented with skill and patience in the forest. He began with stones. Not all were suitable. He tapped each one with his knife, listening for a solid ring. Flakes and chips were removed carefully, forming sharp edges. A jagged flint became a knife. A heavy, rounded rock became a hammer. Balance was crucial. A poorly weighted hammer could injure its wielder. A dull edge could fail at the first cut. He measured, tested, and repeated until the stones became extensions of his hands. Reliable and precise, wood too was selected with care. Certain branches were straight, hard, and resilient, perfect for spear, shafts, or handles. Others were soft, flexible, ideal for bow construction or traps. He stripped bark with deliberate strokes, using a smooth stone to carve grooves for grip and balance. The smell of pine and fresh sap filled the air, a signal that the forest itself was offering resources. Every choice mattered. Every mistake could cost time, energy, or life. Sinew and cordage were the unseen lifelines. Tendons from game were cleaned, twisted, and dried into strong threads. Vines were selected for elasticity and durability. Together, they bound stones to wooden shafts, held hooks in place, and repaired broken tools. In this way, nothing went to waste. Bones, antlers, and even hardened wood fragments were carved into needles, fishhooks, and digging implements. Ingenuity was as vital as strength. Creativity turned the ordinary into life-saving instruments. The frontiersman worked in rhythm. Morning light filtered through pines, highlighting the dust of stone chips and the rough surfaces of sharpened timber. He tested each tool immediately: a spear for thrust, a hammer for strike, a knife for cutting cordage. Efficiency was learned, skill honed through repetition. The forest observed, indifferent but instructive, offering just enough resistance to refine mastery. Every tool was more than a mere object. It was an extension of thought. In the wilderness, decisions were measured in inches and minutes. A stone too heavy could slow him. A spear too short could fail at a critical moment. The act of crafting tools became a meditation, a conversation between mind, hand, and the raw elements of survival. By nightfall, he had a small arsenal: knives, hammers, digging implements, and basic spear tips. They were crude but functional, born of patience, observation, and a deep understanding of the world around him. In the glow of his fire, he examined his creations, understanding that mastery was never final. The wilderness demanded adaptation, constant learning, and ingenuity. A tool could save a life one day and break the next. Yet the process of making it, of thinking carefully, testing and refining, was where true survival lay. In the forest, the mind was as important as the body. The frontiersman smiled faintly, feeling the weight of his tools in hand. Each was proof that knowledge and skill could carve safety from chaos, that man could interact with the wild not as prey, but as an active, creative participant. Primitive tools were not merely instruments. They were lifelines, lessons, and monuments to human resilience in the face of an indifferent wilderness. Survival in the wilderness required more than hunting with tools. It demanded foresight, cunning, and the ability to manipulate the environment. The frontiersmen understood this well. Traps were silent allies, turning the forest itself into a network of assistance. They required observation, patience, and an intimate knowledge of animal behavior, an art long forgotten in modern times. He began with snares. Twisted sinew and vines formed the loops, each carefully calibrated to the size of intended prey. Too tight, and the trap might snap or fail to catch. Too loose, and it could be avoided altogether. Placement was critical. He followed faint tracks through underbrush, looking for signs of feeding, resting, or travel. A snapped twig here, a disturbed leaf there, all guided his hands. The wilderness wrote its instructions on the ground. He only needed to read carefully. Deadfall traps demanded equal precision. He selected heavy logs, balanced meticulously on pivot points, triggered by hidden notches and carefully placed sticks. A single misalignment could ruin hours of work, or worse, injure the trapper himself. He tested the tension repeatedly, adjusting until the mechanism was flawless. Every trap was a delicate conversation with gravity and physics, a subtle negotiation with the forces of the natural world. Pits were another tool in his arsenal. He dug into soft soil, camouflaged the opening with branches and leaves, and lined the walls with sharpened stakes. These were not cruel acts, but necessities. A fallen deer or small predator could provide meat, fur, and warmth, essential resources in a forest where nothing could be taken for granted. He considered every pit's placement carefully, making sure it would not endanger himself or compromise the stealth of his camp. Even simple, friction-based traps demonstrated ingenuity. A carefully placed tripline could trigger a small snare or alarm system, warning him if a predator approached. He combined these systems, setting multiple fail-safes around the perimeter of his camp. The forest became both hunting ground and protective barrier, an extension of his mind and skill. Throughout the day, he checked each trap, making small adjustments, replacing worn sinew and reinforcing weak points. Observation was key. Tracking how animals interacted with the traps taught him subtle lessons about movement, caution, and timing. Failure was instructive, success merely a reminder of patience and attention. He moved silently, leaving no human scent, ensuring the traps remained effective for days. By nightfall, the perimeter around his shelter was a web of preparation. Snares hidden in brush, deadfalls positioned along known trails, pits blended with earth, and trip lines carefully aligned. Each trap was invisible to the casual eye, yet capable of sustaining him in case of hunger. The forest, in all its indifference, had been shaped subtly to serve his survival, not by domination, but through clever adaptation and careful planning. The frontiersman leaned against a tree and observed the result. The traps were not trophies. They were silent sentinels, teaching him humility and respect for the creatures he sought to catch. In the wilderness, survival was a partnership, one with attention, skill, and deep understanding. Every snare, pit, and deadfall was a testament to ingenuity, a bridge between human intellect and raw nature. Fire was survival incarnate. Without it, warmth, cooking, and protection vanished into the wilderness. The frontiersman knew that matches and lighters were luxuries the forest did not provide. To thrive here, he had to summon fire from scratch, using only nature and skill. This was an ancient art, forgotten by most, yet vital to life in the wild. He began with friction, a dry, straight spindle pressed into a carefully prepared fireboard, the tip of the spindle rotating rapidly between his palms. His hands blistered, sweat and dirt mixing into the wood dust that accumulated at the base. Each motion required precision to fast, and he lost control. To slow and heat failed to build. He adjusted pressure, angle, and speed, listening to the faint hiss of warming wood as it released its volatile sparks. Kindling was equally important. He gathered dry pine needles, fine bark fibers, and tender twigs, arranging them in a nest over the smoldering ember. Timing was critical. The ember had to be carefully transferred without disturbance, held in place, and nurtured until flames flickered. He breathed deliberately, exhaling slowly to fan life into the nascent fire. The moment between ember and flame was a fragile bridge. Failure meant returning to patience and labor once more. He also mastered flint and steel, striking sparks onto tinder, prepared from dry moss and shredded bark. The sparks danced like tiny spirits over the fibrous nest. With steady hands, he coaxed the first flicker into a flame, shielding it from wind and moisture. Each fire was a lesson in respect for materials, timing, and the fragile balance of elements. Nature demanded careful attention, rewarding skill with light and warmth. The frontiersman understood that fire was not merely practical, it was psychological. Flames cast shadows against moss-covered walls, providing companionship in isolation. Smoke deterred predators, light guided him through darkness, and the hearth became a stage for meditation and reflection. Even a small flame could instill confidence, survival, and rhythm into a harsh and indifferent world. Fuel management was critical. He chopped small logs, selecting the driest, most resinous branches to sustain the blaze without creating excessive smoke. Logs were added carefully, one at a time, maintaining airflow and consistent heat. Fire, he knew, could not be rushed or overfed. It required observation and patience. Each adjustment shaped its behavior, transforming it from fragile ember to sustaining blaze. Throughout the night, he monitored the fire, aware of its power and fragility. He understood that survival depended on its presence, warmth in bitter cold, safety in darkness, and sustenance through cooking. Every spark he created from friction or flint was a testament to human ingenuity and ancient knowledge, a skill bridging past and present, connecting him to countless frontiersmen before him. By dawn, the fire burned steadily, illuminating the shelter and surrounding forest. Its warmth was a small but profound victory, life shaped from observation, skill, and perseverance. The frontiersman smiled faintly, knowing that mastery of fire without modern tools was not just survival. It was understanding, creativity, and communion with the elements. Water was life, and in the wilderness, it was never guaranteed. Streams could be hidden, stagnant pools contaminated, and snow or rain unreliable. The frontiersman knew that survival depended on locating and purifying water, transforming the unpredictable world into a resource he could trust. Every drop mattered, and every technique could mean the difference between life and death. He began by observing the landscape. Low points in terrain, clusters of moss, animal tracks, and the rustle of vegetation often signaled hidden springs or trickling streams. He followed these clues with patience, understanding that the forest never spoke in certainties, only in subtle suggestions. The sound of moving water, faint and distant, guided him closer, but he remained cautious. Not all water was safe. Even crystal-clear streams could harbor invisible threats. Purification was critical. Boiling was the simplest and most reliable method. Using his fire, he placed a metal pot over the flames, filling it with collected water from the stream. Bubbles rose, steam curled, and the forest's chill was kept at bay. Boiling ensured that pathogens were destroyed, rendering the liquid safe to drink. He understood that survival was a combination of observation, skill, and simple chemistry. Raw water could kill, but treated water restored strength and hope. In the absence of metal vessels, he relied on natural methods. Large leaves fashioned into cups, hollowed logs, and even bamboo sections became temporary containers. Stones were sometimes heated in the fire and placed into water to raise its temperature, a primitive but effective technique. The frontiersman's ingenuity turned raw materials into functional tools, demonstrating that necessity was the mother of invention in the forest. He also knew how to extract water from snow, dew, and plants. Snow was collected, melted carefully over coals, and filtered through cloth to remove debris. Morning dew was captured from leaves using absorbent moss, wrung into containers, and consumed immediately. Certain plants and roots released water when pressed, adding to his daily supply. Knowledge of local flora became as important as skill with tools. The forest itself offered hydration if he observed closely. Safety was always foremost. Contaminated water could not only sicken but weaken him irreversibly. He tested clarity, temperature, and source location. Even after boiling, he allowed the liquid to cool to prevent burns, Drinking was deliberate, measured, and mindful. Each sip reminded him that survival was a practice of attention, not recklessness. By mid-afternoon, he had secured multiple water sources within reach of his shelter. Containers were filled, snow and dew harvested, and a small filtration system established with cloth and sand to remove sediment. The forest now offered life reliably, but only because he had engaged with it fully, combining observation, knowledge, and ingenuity. As he sat by his fire, sipping the purified water, he reflected on the quiet miracle the wilderness provided, but only for those who saw, learned, and adapted. Water was not just liquid. It was patience, understanding, and respect distilled into life-sustaining clarity. And with it, the frontiersman endured another day, prepared for challenges yet unseen. In the wilderness, injuries were inevitable. Cuts from sharp branches, burns from fire, bites from insects or predators. Even a minor wound could become deadly without care. The frontiersman knew that survival required more than strength. It demanded knowledge of the natural pharmacy hidden in the forest, where every plant and tree held potential remedies. He began with basic first aid. Cleanliness was paramount. Using boiled water, he washed cuts and abrasions immediately, preventing infection. Moss and leaves served as makeshift bandages, applied with care to cushion and protect. He wrapped splints from straight branches around injured limbs, secured with sinew, ensuring mobility without further damage. Improvisation was survival, and nothing went to waste. Knowledge of medicinal plants was essential. Willow bark, rich in salicylic acid, was scraped and chewed to relieve pain and reduce inflammation. Certain roots and leaves were boiled into teas to treat fevers and digestive distress. He crushed plant material into poultices for bruises, cuts, and swelling. Observation guided his choices. The forest taught him which plants were safe, which were harmful, and how to combine them for maximum effect. Each treatment was cautious and precise. Experimentation without care could be fatal. Fire played a role in healing as well. Boiling water for steam-treated respiratory ailments. Heated stones were wrapped in cloth and applied to sore muscles or joints. Charcoal from the hearth was used to filter water and, in some cases, treat minor poisoning or skin irritations. Every element of the environment could be repurposed for medicine. Wood, leaves, stones, and fire alike, if one understood its properties and respected its limits. Preventive care was equally vital. He ensured that cuts were protected, insect bites minimized, and hydration maintained. Proper nutrition, gathered from hunting, fishing, and foraging, strengthened the body and supported natural healing. Every meal was not merely sustenance, but a medicine, carefully planned to maintain energy, immune strength, and resilience. Observation extended beyond plants. Certain behaviors of animals indicated useful remedies. Honey from wild bees treated wounds and infections. Clay and mud from specific riverbanks were used to draw toxins from stings or irritations. The frontiersman watched, noted, and applied these lessons with careful respect for the forest's hidden wisdom. As night fell, he checked each wound and applied additional care where necessary. The firelight illuminated leaves, poultices, and splints, casting shadows across his shelter. The forest was indifferent to pain or injury. yet it offered resources for those who knew how to find and use them. Survival depended on vigilance, knowledge, and creativity, and he had mastered all three. He reflected quietly, understanding that improvisation and resourcefulness were as important as strength or courage. A well-tended injury could mean days of survival. Neglect could end life. Medicine in the wild was a delicate balance of skill, observation, and humility, demanding that the frontiersman respect both his body and the forest that sustained him. By dawn, wounds were cleaned, poultices in place, and spirits renewed. He felt the quiet satisfaction of preparation and care, knowing that he had survived another day, not just through skill with tools and traps, but through the wisdom of healing, ingenuity, and attentive observation. The forest, once again, had proven a teacher, and he had listened.